Perfect. So today we are going to talk about mental health. It is a tough environment in the world right now. Many people are struggling, left without a job. We've been in lockdowns. We've been under many different restrictions due to the coronavirus pandemic, and obviously this has an effect on our mental health. And therefore, I have the pleasure of having Marika Melin with me, a researcher at Karolinska University in Stockholm, and an expert on the subject matter. So, first of all, thank you for joining me today, Marika. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting conversation. And I guess we can start off, first of all, by if you can just tell a little bit about yourself, your work, and give our viewers and listeners a bit of an introduction of who you are.
Okay, thank you. Well, Marika Melin, I'm working at, as you said, Karolinska Institutet at the Department of Clinical Neuroscience. And my field of research is work in organizational psychology. And for the last 10 years at least, I've been doing research within the commercial airline business, looking at the working conditions and how they have changed for commercial airline pilots, and looking at the connection between occupational stressors, the changing work conditions, and the pilot's mental well-being mostly. So this is a topic that's really interesting, I think, now during the COVID pandemic also.
And very highly relevant, I would say, as well. I guess we can start off there. I think, there's been quite a few changes in the aviation industry in the past few decades. The retirement age was increased, the working conditions have changed, and even the regulatory framework, Subpart Q, were made some substantial changes to as well. So from your perspective, how has this evolved, and what kind of correlation do you see with how it's been affecting pilots?
Well, both in our studies and in in other studies that have been conducted throughout Europe, we can see that the working conditions has actually worsened during the last at least 10 years due to the causes you mentioned, regulatory changes and so forth, but also due to the market, because nowadays there's such a fierce competition between different airline companies, so they have to all the time press the limits regarding the working conditions that of course are becoming worse due to that. So what we see, for example, is that very many pilots out there flying are quite tired. We have a problem with fatigue, as it's called in this business. We also see that job uncertainty, of course, is a major problem, since very many airlines don't want to hire staff that are staying in the company, but we call it social dumping, where you have business set up in other countries and so forth. So we actually do see quite some problems with the market emerging, and the global competition between airline companies that worsen the working conditions for the pilots.
Understand. And in terms of, in that context, the coronavirus pandemic has definitely removed many jobs from the market in the short term. I saw Boeing release their market outlook 2 days ago here, and they are optimistic. They also, I guess, have some incentives to be, but they are looking at this as a dip. Many people are trying to predict when we're going to get out of it, how the recovery is going to look, but there's so many variables right now that even the best of experts are making futile attempts at accurately predicting it. But it will pass. I believe, and I think that many share that belief with me as well. But I think the question then becomes, how will the people working as pilots, cabin crew, technicians, everybody affected by this, how is it going to affect them? How is it going to affect the talent pool on the other side of this? Are they going to want to stay in the industry? Are they going to to pursue other educations or pursue other career options. And what's your perspective there? What's the healthy thing to do now if you find yourself without a job? What would your advice be to someone in that situation?
Yeah, actually, two huge questions. The first one, what will happen, and how does it affect mental health, mental well-being? And I think actually none of us actually know. What I do know is that there are so many initiatives from EASA, from EAP, the European Aviation Association for Psychology, EPSI, working with a peer support initiative and so forth. But actually none of us knows how this affects the pilots. What we do know from previous psychological research is that factors such as job uncertainty, that you don't know what's going to happen. Perhaps people worry about their economy. You're used to having a certain salary, a certain way of living and so forth. That affects us very much in relation to the well-being, how we are feeling, and of course then mental ill health also. So we do know that many of the variables people are experiencing right now, being without work, not knowing what would happen in the future, that we know isn't good for your health, of course. What will happen in the future, like you talk about, who will want to work, will people want to stay in this industry? We know nothing about that. But I think talking about the identity also, which is another important actually subject connected to mental well-being, because mostly we are quite identified with the kind of work that we do, and the loss of that can also affect your mental health. So I think if I'm just thinking about it, I would say that quite many people will stay on for quite some time to wait and see what will happen in the industry. They won't let go immediately. And the other question, what can you do by yourself? There are also many of the big organizations like EASA and EPSI and so forth. They have, I think, published some kind of guides to mental well-being. What can you do by yourself? In that they mention the biological well-being, of course. Can you eat? Can you exercise? And so forth. The social, being around, since you don't meet your colleagues, you're not in a working context, it becomes even more important to stay in touch with people, don't just be alone all day. And of course then the psychological part, the coping strategies, the attitude towards life, how you cope with the whole situation, keeping up your routines, your everyday life, even though job no longer gives you the routines, you have to keep up the routines and so forth. So talking on the individual level, I think most people today know quite a lot about this, keeping up the routines, exercising, keeping social and so forth. But the larger questions about the identity, about the uncertainty of the future, those are, I think, the really hard questions for people to cope with.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It's such a huge part of our identity, and I feel, especially so with pilots and people that work in the aviation industry, are very proud of what they do. They really enjoy it, and then I guess that becomes even more challenging to deal with when something like this happens, right? But there's a few really good things that you said there, and I just struck my mind when you were speaking about this, the socializing part. Depending on where you are, you're in Sweden, I'm in Norway, it's pretty free here. We have the situation fairly under control. Yes, there are measures, social distancing and hygiene, a lot of focus on that, even wearing masks when in public and that type of thing. But some countries have been in lockdown both once and twice, and it could be really challenging to get that social aspect of it in there. But do you think, and this is more of a personal question, I guess, but it just piqued my curiosity, do you think that all the technology we have right now can sort of feed some of that social urge? Like now we're talking, we see each other, that type of thing, FaceTiming each other, going on a Zoom call, does that have that positive effect? I guess it's not quite the same, but...
No, as you say, it's not the same, but of course it helps. I mean, all kind of social interaction helps. It helps talking on the phone, it helps texting on your iPhone and so forth, and of course seeing each other. This is not my specialty, not my topic, but of course it can't... it's not the same thing when you meet people in real life, because you have another kind of interaction. You see the faces and you see the body language and so forth. But of course it helps, and keeping up to date, talking to people, perhaps seeing them that you have nearby also. And of course people like you and me who are sitting in Stockholm and Oslo, it's much nicer to talk like this, to see each other, than it is perhaps just to talk on the phone or write a text message. So I think it's a very good way. When we can't meet, this is the second best to keep updated and to keep social. And also to make yourself, because sometimes if you're starting to feel a bit bad, it's very easy that you withdraw, that you don't keep up with your social life. So I think talking about routines, it's also quite important that you keep up your social life, even though perhaps you don't long yourself to call someone or go for a walk with someone, but you almost have to make yourself do it just to because you feel well afterwards. So and that's a sign also that perhaps you need it more than ever.
Good point. You mentioned that there's a lot of initiatives going on from many organizations, and the platform will be broadcasting this on Crew Assist. That's also the goal of that platform, to enable flight crew to stay relevant, to stay current, to have that sort of professional environment to engage with. And where it's going to go from here, I don't know. We're going to be a lot up to the members and the feedback that we get from them. But I hope and think that that's going to enable people to engage with their identity and to kind of stay active in that sense, not in the social sense, but in the professional sense. And it's going to be a real challenge for us to get back to the usual. As you know, the aviation industry is a very well-oiled machinery, and it's dependent on that it continues to run all the time, because we need to stay recent, we need to stay up to speed with all the skills and everything. And I don't really know where I'm going with this, but I guess what I'm trying to ask here, or what I'm trying to get to, is what do you see as the major challenges when we're going to get back to normalcy from a mental health standpoint, and from like re-engaging and getting people back on the horse sort of thing? From your perspective, are there any challenges there? Are there any questions that you guys are asking yourselves, or is mainly the focus right now on like, how can we gather data from the situation that is going on to learn from it after the fact, and how can we help people? Is that the main focus, or do you have discussions about how we get back towards the new normal?
I actually think that within the research area, looking into these things, and especially in this context, I think actually the focus is on both. And I think there are also worries concerning both how are people doing right now, and what will happen when, things will get back to perhaps not normal as we know normal, but things will get back into production, of course, I think. So I think there are worries both about right now, how are people actually doing out there? Because I think there we also have a problem with the pilots that has actually lost their job. Who's responsible for their well-being? If you have lost your job already, otherwise you can just turn to the company, and we know that there are very many, in most organizations you can get help and so forth. But if you have lost your job, who will you turn to get help then? And the second question, what will happen when the pilots that are still do have an employment in their airline companies when they get back, when they have to start flying again. And I think we have very many question marks there too, because both how are they doing concerning mental health when they get back, the training, the learning, the keeping up to date. So we do have many questions actually. But concerning what happens when people get back, we don't have any answers yet, because we don't know yet, and we can't look into it yet either. But I think, as we also know, that airline pilots are a bit usually reluctant to seek help when they have perhaps mental health problems, if they are feeling depressed or have anxiety or stress-related symptoms. I think this is more important than ever to really address these questions, because we know from earlier research, looking at figures, how many pilots in Europe, in the whole world, have depressive symptoms, for example. There are a few studies about that, and that range from perhaps 2 to 13%, which is as the general population in average. So pilots don't have less problems than the general populations, which one could perhaps think, since everyone is so well tested. And that's very important to keep in mind. However, we do know that pilots are more reluctant perhaps than the general population to seek help. And that is of course a problem, because we want people to seek help as early as possible to be able to address them before they cause too many problems, of course. So I think one of the major issues is to really get people to seek help before it gets to big problems.
That's very good advice. Why do you think that pilots are reluctant to seek that medical advice when it comes to mental health? I mean, I guess there's some stigma about this in society in general, even though I think we've made progress. Obviously, you know more about this than I do, but it's not as stigmatized as before. But why do you think pilots in particular are reluctant to sort of expose themselves if they have, or they're concerned that they have mental health issues?
I think the first cause is the one that you mentioned, that it is stigmatized to seek help, and especially, in different professions it's more stigmatizing than in others, of course, and I think the pilot profession is one of the professions where it is very stigmatized. The second, which I can understand it so well, because if I would seek help as a researcher, as a psychologist, I won't lose my job. But if you seek help as a pilot, let's say someone comes to me and I say, okay, we have depressive symptoms, let's say someone has to take some kind of medication, then you know that your certificate can be in danger. So there's a big problem. You won't seek help if you know you can lose your job while you're seeking help. And I think that's why this new initiative with the pilot peer support programs tries to somehow detect and prevent without people fearing to have consequences, meaning that they perhaps in the end will lose their jobs. So I think that's a major thing that causes people not to seek help, and fully understandable. But it's a big problem.
Absolutely. If you're concerned that I could need help, but if I do, I'm going to lose my job.
Exactly.
Obviously.
Yeah.
It's interesting. You mentioned peer support. Is that part of the solution?
I'm not sure. It could be. That's one of the initiatives coming out from the terrible German wings accident and the BR report afterwards. Then the EASA rules concerning aptitude tests and test of mental health within medical class 1 were introduced, and also now from I think February 2021 will all airline companies have to have some kind of peer support programs. I think it could be one way, if it's implemented correctly. I think, of course, as a researcher, we have to look at all the problematic issues also, and I think it's very important the confidentiality and the trust bit, that you really dare to contact the peer, that you know that what you say to the peer will stay at the peer. And that's of course a problem, because if someone calls the peer with substantial big problems, mental health issues, then the peer has to report it somehow. So it could work, but I think it has to be implemented with big care to function well.
Yeah, that's I think it's been a very, obviously you mentioned there the German wings accident, and there was a lot of discussion going on in the industry after that, and people wanted something to happen. It's part, we've been at our academies, we've done screening for the longest time because we know that it works, and it's really helpful both for the individual, for the training organization, and then later on for the employer as well. But I think so. I'm really positive towards that being implemented or regulated, I should say. And at the same time, some of and I'm no expert in this, but some of the medical professionals that I've spoken to within aviation has also brought up the argument that, okay, it's very good that we're doing these things. It's very good that the initial screening and everything is done and it's mandatory. And peer support programs also has the potential to be positive, but there's also some risks. But they also mentioned that, that we can't do just samples here and there, because if you are evaluated this year and then you move along in your career and then life happens, something like this, pandemic strikes, but it could also be something very personal. It could be a divorce, loss of a family member, or something like that. That's tough to deal with, and I think that it's a very global industry. You work different places, different bases, and that kind of stuff. And some of the pilots that I've spoken to have said that it's back to basics also in some sense. Throughout the course of a career, there needs to be a sort of a collegial community. The people that you work with, the people at your base, do you meet them? Do you interact with them? Do they see you? Because then they have this baseline of who you are, and they'll be able to see, okay, well, something's not right now. Stein is not himself. He's not as happy as he used to be, or he seems to be, something seems to be up. I should have a chat with him. Once again, I don't really know where I'm going with this, but it sparks my neurons when you're talking. It's so interesting, such an interesting topic. But what do you see if we, initial screening, that's important, the aptitude, the clinical, psychological evaluation, the peer support, or the network around you, that we see each other, that we reach out if we feel like something is off and we talk to each other. But what other things, from your perspective, could be helpful systematically to create a better environment in the aviation community?
There's actually many things, of course. But I was thinking about when you were thinking about the initial screenings, and there the aviation psychologist and I think the aviation medicals are very think very similar around this, and we of course would like to have some kind of recurrent screening, not screening but recurrent, that you can talk about what has happened in your life during the last year. Like you have recurrent medical checks, you can have recurrent psychological checks, because if we had that, we could perhaps in an early stage see if there are any, like you say, life events. All of us during life, few people go through life without any, not perhaps traumatic, but some kind of life events that are not that good. So if you could have some kind of psychological recurrent like you have medical, I think we could prevent many people to go into more severe psychological ill health, actually, because very many of the disorders that we see are perhaps depression or anxiety, and today we have very good ways of dealing with that. So that's one thing I think would be very, very helpful. And of course, the other thing that we mentioned that is crucial, and that the just culture also that very many airline companies work with, I think that's a very important factor, the trust factor, that you really feel that if you say something to a peer or to your medical examiner or to your psychologist, that you feel comfortable talking about these things without immediately being afraid of being reported somewhere or grounded or something. And of course that's very difficult sometimes, because sometimes there can be problems that need to be addressed in that way. But I think there's something very important there, the trust factor, and how to make the pilots feel comfortable talking about perhaps stuff like life events, how does it affect me, without being afraid of getting the some kind of diagnosed with mental ill health, because very few actually have what we call mental health disorders. Very many of us feel bad in periods of our lives, but that doesn't mean that it's a mental health disorder. And I think to make a difference between those things is very, very important. So to your question, what could be done? Well, of course, looking at the working conditions, because we know very much about how working conditions affect us. Like, for example, we have studies showing that if you are perhaps reprimanded, if you call in sick due to unfitness or something, that's one important factor that you are bound to feel even worse, of course. Recovery, scheduling, I mean, basic stuff also, of course, affects our psychological well-being too. So I think there are lots of things to do within the aviation industry that could promote well-being, actually. Both very, very, I mean, objective factors within the frameworks, and of course, like you're talking about, in social interaction, in the culture. I mean, not only the just culture, but also within the culture of the company. What's allowed to do and what's not allowed to do. And of course, if you don't have an employment where you know that you are able to stay, if you have just a contract or pay to fly or something, then of course you're afraid of doing things that could make you lose your job. And that's of course a safety factor and a mental health well-being factor.
Yeah. Oh, I shudder when you said pay to fly. Ugh, it's horrible. I think that's fairly easy for most to understand that that's not a good structure to have. Unfortunately, it does pop up every now and then. But yeah, we need a just culture and a trust culture. That's, I think, kind of interweaves a little bit with each other. But like you said, it's really tough. You know, when you look at it and you say, yeah, just culture, trust between people feeling safe, that's what we should have. That's easy to say, but it's tough to do, and consistently make sure that you have that level of trust. But I think you pointed out something really good, that it's possible to break it down, and using your research and your data, that's something I really hope resonates and is registered with the ones that are responsible for building these structures and setting up the companies where the crew is going to work and fly and so on and so forth. Because the data is there; it shows these are the things that people need. Security. You can't be, calling in sick should be a no-brainer. If you're not healthy, if you're not fit to fly, you're not supposed to be in a cockpit on a flight deck. So, yeah. It's I really think the work you're doing is so important, and I think one thing that I'm thinking about now when you're speaking as well is you gather a lot of data, you ask a lot of relevant questions, you seek out the answers, and then this is delivered through EASA, through the regulatory bodies, out to the operators and applied into legislation and that type of thing. That's the process. That's the way it looks, right?
Yeah, hopefully. At least we deliver the results and the knowledge. Sometimes, I mean, we work quite hard also for it to be used out there, like you said, from the regulatory authorities like EASA, and I feel that perhaps sometimes when there are some regulatory changes, I get a bit surprised actually sometimes, because I think we have so much knowledge today, objective knowledge from a research point of view, like we're talking about now. We know so much about how the working conditions affects the culture, what you dare to say, if you can say to your manager, for example, that this is a problem, or I feel worried about this. I mean, it all comes down to the working conditions, if you feel safe. And of course, there the employment conditions are crucial. And we know a lot about other conditions too, if you're too tired, what kind of schedule you have. So it boils down to that the objective working conditions also affect the psychosocial, of course, working conditions. And those conditions combined affects how you behave. We know so much about this. So in our research, we try to, like you say, identify the most working conditions, riskful working conditions, and see how they affect the behavior. Like, for example, when we look at, in some of our studies, presenteeism, that is when you fly despite that you know that you shouldn't fly, we see direct connections to the working conditions, like we have been talking about, being afraid of being reprimanded if you call in sick or unfit. It's about the employment, of course, condition. It's also about the social environment, the psychosocial factors, like if you feel that your manager are listening to you, if you can talk about problems and so forth. So we know so much about this, and I don't think it's quite used within the industry, neither from the authority point of view or from the airline companies. But what we're working on that, but sometimes I can feel it's not used the way it could be used.
That's a shame. It really is. I think, but it's both in terms of this. I think also, I can't remember where I heard this, but someone a while back when they were making the regulatory changes with regards to rest periods and that type of thing, EASA went in the opposite direction as the United States. FAA became more stringent. EASA went the opposite way. And they all have access to the same information, because information is much more accessible now than it used to be. And then it becomes fascinating. So how did they use that information and arrive at completely different solutions for how the regulations should look? It's uplifting to hear that you and those in the research community are actively working to not only find the answers and present the information, but actually follow up to try and ensure that it's applied properly. And it's also frustrating to hear that you don't see it deployed to the full extent that it should be. So, yeah, what do you think? What do you think happens there? Like, why not take this information into account? Is it the pressures of the commercial interests? What makes that happen?
Well, of course, I can only speculate, but I think what you mentioned, it's the market, it's the commercial pressure, and of course that is a problem that we have to take into account also. I mean, we could, in fantasy world, I could build an airline company where I know the working conditions is perfect and everyone will feel excellent, of course. But we have to we have to relate to how the world looks and how the market competition looks. But I think, like you were saying, I'm a bit afraid that sometimes there are too many, too big market pressure, too much consideration concerning the economy, rather than looking into what we actually know. Because I got surprised too, what you said about the change of the regulation concerning sleep and scheduling and so forth. Because we have so much knowledge within that area too, and still they went ahead and did changes in the quite opposite direction. And of course, sometimes also from a psychological perspective, we know that it's much easier to, assimilate things and believe in things that we already think is true. Like, for example, if I read in the paper that, well, red wine is good for your health, yeah, of course, I want to believe that. If I a day later read that red wine is not good for my health, well, perhaps these researchers don't know exactly what to do. So I think we have two dimensions in this. One is the market, the economy, that's strong. But we also have the people sitting within these committees. What do they believe? I have met so many times during my period doing this kind of research where I met the view that, well, why do you keep on looking into this? Because we all know that pilots are quite spoiled. They do have quite good, working conditions. So there are concepts of how things are, and I think that affects it too.
Yeah, it's interesting perspective to bring that into the discussion.
Yeah.
Say, why are you asking these questions? They have it well, they're well off. Just leave it be.
Yeah, they're well off. They have high salaries. I mean, in the general view, I think airline pilots are viewed as people who have high salaries and quite luxurious lives, quite good lives, good, nice working conditions where you fly all over the world. I think the general perception is that, and in some airline companies you meet that from the management too, that perhaps are not flying themselves. And that is a problem, of course. And that's why we want to bring objective facts on the table to show that, we don't take sides. We look at how it is.
Yeah, there's a disconnect there. That's interesting. It really is. Yeah, it's what was that? What's that quote again? It's not what we don't know that gets us into trouble. It's what we know for certain that just ain't so. Right?
Right, that's a good one.
It is. It's so true. And I, like you said, when you mentioned that example with the red wine, that's why it had me smiling, because I'm inclined to believe that first study as well.
Yeah.
It's a glass of wine. It's good for you.
Exactly.
So I understand it. We're all guilty of it, so to speak. It's not. We're not immune to that effect.
We're not.
But yeah.
That's why we have to do our research scientific and objective, and that's why it's so important, because if it comes from, all the from other places, we don't know who's the sender, and then we can't quite believe it. But if it's research, we don't take sides. We are quite objective in this, and we want to know how it is and draw conclusions from what we see in the data and in the results. And I think we do actually have, there was a saying, I think, within the economy research, build back better, quoting. I think we taking care of this situation, it is some kind of building back now after the COVID situation. And I think it can go in two directions. There is a chance that this could build back better, that we actually take into account all what we know about the working conditions and pilot mental health and so forth. But it could also go, which scares me sometimes, in the other direction, where you have more bad employment conditions, where you have perhaps more of dry leases and wet leases and everything leases, where we can't control the employment conditions and working conditions. So I think it's very important to follow where the industry is going after now the COVID pandemic, so it goes in the right direction.
Yeah, that's a very good point. We need to be vigilant. I also I'm an optimist.
Yeah, me too.
I hope that's the first scenario that plays out, that pans
Yeah,
out.
me too. But I
you're
think we have to be
absolutely right.
active
There's some real
to
risk. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I think we have to be active now to fulfill the optimistic view that we both have, and really see to that it becomes a reality rather than the other one.
Yeah. We have to be active now to make sure that's the future that we end up in.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, and I think it's like you said, it's gonna be interesting to see how it pans out, and I think we need to champion the first scenario that you described. But also, I understand your concern, because now, at least in the short term, there will be a situation where, there's a surplus of pilots and much fewer jobs than what it used to be, and we'll get back to normalcy. People will start traveling again. There's no doubt about that. But in the interim period, we need to make sure that we don't end up with a structure that we carry with us, with bad working conditions for years to come. I think that's a really good point you're making. We need to really be vigilant about that, because I mentioned sometimes that people now that find themselves without a job, pilots, for example, and then you could start studying something else. You could get a different education. That's true for some, but it is definitely not true for all, because people have a family, they have a mortgage, they have obligations, that might not even be an option. And then if you, as a pilot, I think pilots are excellent to hire, by the way. It's completely biased, of course. But it's much more than just flying a plane. It's problem solving, it's the decision making, it's the teamwork, the communications, lots of these skills that they've trained on a lot, worked with under pressure, that is very applicable to other industries. It's just the industry knowledge that's lacking. But pilots are also extremely good at acquiring new information, at least in my experience. So, hire a pilot. They're absolutely amazing. But I can, like you said, for pilots, it's also a big part of the identity to fly around the globe, to fly an aircraft, and to work with a crew. It's a very special, unique feeling that you want to get back. You want to get back to it. And that creates a strong incentive, a really strong incentive to get back on the horse, which might result in people accepting conditions that are suboptimal. Let's just put it that way.
Exactly. And of course, in the end, all of this affects the flight safety. So we see, we do have the connection. We see the direct link between the working conditions, mental health, well-being, because if you're not feeling well, if you're depressed or you have anxiety or you're having life problems, we know how much that affects your cognitive functioning, like you're talking about now. And I can only agree, it's decision making, it's social skill, it's problem solving and everything. But if you're not feeling good, if you have some kind of depression or anxiety or something like that, we are so affected in our cognitive functioning too. So it all boils down to that this is really a safety issue, as you say, during this period also. And another safety issue that's not been fully addressed, I think, it's that right now we have very many crews flying around there where everyone actually has lost their jobs. And how do they function? How do they work? How do they feel? How does that affect their cognitive functioning? So we have so many things now going on that we have never met or seen before. But I do agree with you. Hire a pilot. but during that time, and most will not. Most people, of course, want to keep their job. They have become pilots for a reason. They want to be pilots. But I see many safety issues during this period before we know where it's going to.
Hmm. Thank you so much for this conversation, Marika. It's always a pleasure talking to you, and I thank you for sharing all your insights and your knowledge in this area. And I think before we wrap the discussion up, is there anything else you'd like to make a point out of? Is there any other message you'd like to get out there that's relevant in the situation that we're in right now?
Oh, hard question. So many things. But, well, if it should be something, I mean, if we're talking about the individual level, I think there's so many instruction about this. What should you do? I mean, we talked about it, keeping up routines and exercising and so forth. But there are also, I mean, simple ways of thinking, like with the help of coping strategies. You know, if you're starting to feel quite bad, you're starting to feel depressive symptoms, life isn't as nice as it used to be, you feel a bit hopeless, your identity is wobbling and everything. There are easy ways of, not easy, but there are methods that you can quite easily acquire in your thinking about taking one day at the time, doing something that you really enjoy every day, and so forth. So I think it's quite easy to Google how you can help yourself, because it's easy that you see what will happen to me and you despair. We don't know what's happened. Everything is so big and so hard to get a grip on. So just taking one day at a time, sometimes perhaps even 1 hour at a time, and see that this is a phase. Somehow I will come out in the other end. I think on an individual level, it's important to not be overwhelmed by all of this, and of course have future plans, but not worry about too much about the future, but take one day at a time. I think that's a good way to try to cope for yourself. And then of course we, like you and I and everyone working within this field, we have to be on our toes, as we have been talking about, to see that this is now going in the right direction. We build back better. We don't want to build back worse. So we have to be on our toes. So in both levels, individual and more organizational.
Well, that's a perfect way, I think, to sum up this discussion with some great advice. Look out for yourself, look out for each other, and it's our collective responsibility to look out for the fact that we need to build a better tomorrow.
Yeah.
Well said. Once again, thanks a lot for this conversation, Marika, and have a nice weekend. It's Friday.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Nice weekend, you too.
All right. Ciao.
Ciao.